But when the fullness of time came. Now, this idea of fullness of time has to do with a set period of time. There was a point that God had predetermined. There was a date on His calendar that He had set from eternity past. When this date gets here, I will send my Son. That will give Him enough time to get things ready for Him. But there was a set point. All of the Old Testament, in fact, if you recall, in Daniel, he knew the hour, or rather, he knew the day in which would come. He knew the year in which Christ would be arriving. He knew the very time in which He would not only come and be born, but also when He would go to the cross. All that was given throughout the Old Testament. God had set it down in writing that my Son will arrive, and He will arrive the time I have set for Him, and nothing could prevent it. When the fullness of time came, when God said, all right, it's time, the angels announced it, and the baby cried in that manger. His mother gave birth. When the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son, coming into being out of a woman. His virgin birth. One of the tenets of the gospel, the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, having come under the law, that He might redeem those under the law, so that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So that you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, also an heir of God through Christ. We are an heir of God. I got a letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs dealing with my mother after her passing. And basically it said, your husband is a white man, gets nothing. Your 8 children will divide your inheritance. So 0 divided by 8, each of your kids will get nothing as well. And so, but at least we had that. They sent us a letter letting us know, boom, here it is. We are an inheritance. Whatever my mom had, we each had an equal share in that. Whatever God is, we have an equal share in Him, as does Christ. We are joint heirs with Christ. We are children of God, just as Christ is the Son of God, so are we. My sister Linda, though she is older than me, gets the same percentage that I get. My brother Randy, younger than me, gets the same percentage that I get. We each got 1/8 of my mother's estate. And so here we are now. We are joint heirs with Christ. Whatever God is and whatever He holds, we are heirs with Christ, equal standing with Christ in all that God has. This is the promise. This is the promise. But we notice when the fullness of time was come. Baby girl, if you'd press that button for me. First of all, we're told that God sent His Son and sent Him in the fullness of time. That is on God's calendar when it was ready. When things were prepared, where things were as God wanted them to be, Jesus Christ came. Now there was some work that had to be done. And God did think this through. And so I want to share with you a couple of ways in which the fullness of time had come. Some of the things the world didn't note. Remember when Mary and Joseph, although it had been pre-recorded, and although God had wrote it down in His book, and although people should have expected when Jesus Christ, when His mom and dad came knocking at the door, nobody had room. They were not ready. Even though the fullness of time, everything that the prophets had said had come to pass, and everybody should have been. The wise men in the east knew it, and they traveled all that way to see the baby. But those who were around Him had no notice of Him at all. Next slide. First of all, how did God prepare the world? Well, we look at the Romans, for example. When the fullness of time had come, the world was under one particular government. The Romans had conquered by this time the world, and so now the world had no obstacles. The whole world at the time of Jesus Christ was at peace. So that when his gospel would go to be preached, they could travel from place to place without any incident whatsoever. They could travel freely throughout the whole world to propagate the gospel of Jesus Christ, because God made sure that there were the Babylonian Empire, which would begin to consolidate the Middle East. And then the Persian Empire would come up underneath that, and the construction of things would begin. And then the Greeks would come, and the Greeks would take everything from Greece all the way over to India, and they would teach their culture and their language to the whole world. When the Romans came along, they were educated people. And they realized, you know what? It will take us centuries to get the whole world to know Latin. The whole world already knows Greek. So the Romans taught themselves Greek so that when they moved into the rest of the world, they were ready. The whole world didn't have to be retrained. The whole world already knew Greek culture. The whole world already knew the Greek language. And so when Jesus Christ came and the gospel was prepared, they could take that. That's why your Bible, your New Testament rather, is written in Greek. It could travel quickly throughout the whole world without any impedance at all, because everybody everywhere could hear and understand the gospel, because the whole world knew and understood the Greek language and the Greek culture. So when they preach to us and they use ideologies or ideas from a Greek world, the whole world knew what they were talking about. So when they speak of Hades, everybody knows what they're talking about. When they speak of the Spirit, everybody understands what the Spirit is. These words were already impressed into the mind of the whole world. And we are grateful because the Romans had come. They had reduced all the world to one government. The gospel now could spread very, very quickly. Jesus Christ, when he came, in fact, it was the Roman government that ensured the fulfillment of that Bethlehem promise. It was the Roman emperor who said, I want everybody to go back to their ancestral home to be counted. I want to know how many people I have in the kingdom, so I know how much tax I should be able to raise. And because of that, Joseph and Mary find themselves in Bethlehem. The angels know exactly where to meet. They know exactly where to send people. It all was laid out. This one world government would be useful in sending out the gospel of Jesus Christ. Under the protection of Rome, the gospel could spread, although it wasn't their intent. God still used it. And so God used these early empires, particularly the Romans, to help us to make sure the way in which things would spread, this would be a way for it to go. Not only the Roman government, but because it was worldwide, transportation, and remember, governments, just as today, had one purpose, and the way that the nation grew, it grew through its commerce, its ability to sell its product to the rest of the world. And so the Romans had shipping lanes, which, of course, you know the three travels of Paul when he traveled the world, took by ship. Shipping lanes that the Romans had established. They had marvelous highways, concrete highways that they had poured throughout the world so that people could travel very quickly from place to place. And this would also help the gospel to travel very quickly. In Paul's lifetime, because of the commerce of the Roman Empire, in Paul's lifetime, the gospel could go all the way from North Africa, around the Middle East, and all the way out to England. It reached as far as Britain in the lifetime of Paul. Within 30 to 40 years, the gospel was able to make its way throughout the Roman government, all the way from the British, across over here where you had the Germans, all the way around through North Africa. All that area and land and peoples could know and understand. They could quickly get the gospel. As we mentioned, the Greek language and culture, which would be necessary. Your New Testament, written in Greek. When Jesus preached, normally preaching in Greek to his people, Normally, they would be able to, Paul could communicate very quickly. And so, again, the language, sweetheart, next slide. But not only this, but by the chosen people, the Jews themselves, although they still had the temple there in Jerusalem, well, they were taken captive going way back to the Babylonians. The Jews instituted what they called synagogues. If there were 10 Jewish families in a town, they would build themselves a synagogue. A synagogue would act as a church, it would act as a school, and it would act as a court system for the Jewish people. When you had a fight, they would come to the synagogue. The synagogue would then become the judicial place, and they would listen to your argument, and they would render a judgment. So the Jewish system of law would travel. And by the invention, we should say, or advent of synagogues, the Jewish families in small towns had these religious centers popping up. And so the temple still in Jerusalem, but synagogues would now spread throughout the whole world. So when Paul would come, it was Paul's practice when he went into a new town, he would always go first to the Jews. Why? Because there was already a synagogue. There was already a place where the Jewish families would get together. And he knew that he could reach at least a minimum of 10 Jewish families because that was the requirement. The moment a 10th family moved into the area, you were required by law to build a synagogue. So Paul could go to the synagogue. He could preach Jesus Christ. He could take their Old Testament where God had promised in the fulfillment of time that he would send his son. He would sit there and show them how that time had been fulfilled and how that Christ was the fulfillment of that promise. So quickly then, from synagogue to synagogue, this news could spread. And very quickly it could go throughout the whole Roman world because the Jews were compelled under captivity to begin the process of these synagogues. So wherever you went, there was already an idea and an ideal in place. The Jews had been spread throughout, peppered throughout the whole world by this time. The Romans found them very useful. The Greeks found them very useful. The Babylonians found them very useful. The Persians would always go to the Jews to get their ideas, to make them leaders in their communities. Their ideas. Look at Daniel. How many kings did call upon Daniel for service? Daniel, would you help us with this? Daniel, would you explain this to us? Daniel. And so the Jewish people were well respected around the world. When the Romans came in, they would often come to the Jews when they wanted to establish a new city, and they would ask that the Jews would go there. For example, if you went to Philippi, initially started, Philippi was a Roman colony. These colonies had the same benefits as did Rome itself. Paul was from a town called Troas. Troas was also a Roman colony. They would take these Jewish families, they would establish a Roman city in this area, and the Jews would be given Roman citizenship. That's why Paul, his citizenship was very important. As he traveled, remember when he got to Philippi and they beat him. And they came by and they said, all right, you're allowed to go free. Paul said, He said, you beat a Roman citizen. And all of a sudden, everybody in town got scared. Because if you beat a Roman citizen, the Roman army would not be far behind. All that citizen had to say was, I was mistreated. And all of a sudden, there you had a Roman legion on your doorstep. And so when suddenly Paul said, and they said, listen, I bought that right with a lot of money. Paul said, yeah, I was free-born. I was born in a Roman colony as a Roman citizen. All of a sudden, fear and trepidation. And Paul would use that on several accounts. His Romanness, if you would, helped in the spreading of the gospel. Allowed it to go far and wide. The Jews, Paul's own people, he would go to them first. It was a very fertile field with the people because he could take their Old Testament. He didn't have to create a new religion. Jesus Christ is preached throughout the Old. He could go to Isaiah. He could go to Jeremiah. He could go to any of the Old Testament. He could read to them Psalm 22 and then give them the headline from Jerusalem on the day that Christ was crucified. And you read Psalm 22 where he says, they have pierced my hands and my feet. And the words, my God, exactly what Jesus Christ quoted from the cross. And suddenly, boom, he had his audience. And they could see that God was fulfilling his word. So when the fullness of time was come, God gave his Son. And the Jews would be very ripe field for the gospel. And then they could in turn take it to their neighbors and to their friends. They could take it to the next city, the next town. And suddenly the gospel was being spread. Why? Because the Jewish people had set up for the last several centuries now these synagogues throughout the whole world. God was preparing. He had his people preparing. He had the language being prepared. He had a one world government established, and so there was peace so that the people could travel, the gospel could travel unhindered. Next. But heathenism itself, people were becoming discontented with their old religion. They noticed that the old gods didn't seem to have the power they once had. And so the deities, the false gods began to wane, began to lose their power. Oh, let me tell you, the religions of the world were trying very hard to hold on because this is money. Those priests of Jupiter and the priests of whoever else was out there were very anxious to try to hold on. But the people themselves, by large numbers, had given up on the idea of the gods. And they were ready for something new. And all of a sudden, when Paul went to Rome or went to Athens, he went to Mars Hills, he said, let me tell you about the unknown God. And suddenly people were ready for this. They were ready to hear that, because under Greek theology and Roman theology, the gods toyed with men. They played with them. They didn't love them. They didn't care for them. They used them. And suddenly Jesus Christ is preached, and we find out that God so loved the world. What do you mean, God loves? The fact that any deity was given love toward a man or could love a human person, not just lustfully, because that's all the Greeks and the Romans, their gods only knew lust toward women. And suddenly here it was that God wasn't lusting after anybody, but he loved the whole world enough to give his Son. And so this idea, this fresh thought, would very quickly spread like fire through the Roman Empire. It would spread through its armies who would come in contact with the people of Palestine. It would spread throughout the world because as one Roman legion was transferred to this place and this place, they would take the gospel that they heard and they would share it around. Eventually, the fall of the Roman Empire grew because so many of the folks in the army had become Christians. They couldn't persecute them anymore. There were too many. It just sheer weight of Christianity toppled everything, changed everything. This heathenism, although it was still there, we still see it popping its head up even in the days of Jesus Christ and in the early days of the church. We had the riots there in Ephesus. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Great is Diana but they had to get them all worked up. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. But the world itself, the people themselves, outside of I suppose the clergy of these different deities, the common people weren't all that interested. They knew it was just a money-making racket. This man was hollering and screaming because he made silver deities and sold them. And as Diana began to die down in popularity, he wasn't selling as many of these little statues of her as he once did. And the people began to realize, whoa, it's all about money. It was never about love. It was never about me. It was never about where I am going to spend my eternity. It was always about this. And people began to see it. And so heathenism began to lose its repute and its power with the people. See, God was preparing a world government that could bring about peace so that the gospel could be safely transported everywhere on marvelous highways and wonderful shipping lanes. And so the gospel very quickly could spread throughout the world. And then he had a common language established so that that was prepared and ready to go. And the world would know and very quickly be able to receive the gospel of Jesus Christ because they could understand it themselves. And finally, of course, with the religions of the world beginning to fall back and die down, the gospel again could begin to grow. But here's my point. When Jesus Christ came, even though God had gone through all that trouble, nobody added it all up. Wow, here we are in a worldwide time of peace. Nobody saw it. Here we have this marvelous system of transportation so that Mary and Joseph could travel from Nazareth down to Bethlehem without any difficulties or troubles. Nobody saw the importance of it. The idea that God had the whole world speaking one common language, nobody put two and two together. The fact that the world's religions were beginning to wane in their influence. Again, nobody looked, nobody saw. So that when Mary and Joseph came to Bethlehem, the promised city of the Savior, on the day that God said he should be born, and you have a woman who is clearly expecting, I need a place to give birth to my son. I'm sorry, we have no room for you. My thought and wonderment is this, that maybe we should consider for just a moment this phrase, in the fullness of time. And maybe we should consider it in the advent of the second coming of Jesus Christ. Jesus said to you and to me, can you not discern the times and the seasons? But, like in his day, when Jesus came the first time, people had been preaching the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming, the King is coming, the King is coming. And they had been preaching it for years. They were preaching that Christ would come when they were taken captive by the Babylonians. The Messiah will deliver us. And they were taken captive by the Persians. Oh, but just you wait. Messiah is on his way. And the Greeks came through. And after the Greeks, surely Messiah is coming. No, it was just the Romans. So when they finally stood up and said, Messiah is coming, people said, listen, we're tired of hearing that. You've been telling us for a long time that Jesus is coming, and he ain't got here yet. And they were saying that the day he was born. They come and they knock on the door of the inn and they said, and he says, listen, this king is coming. Not here he is. Maybe you can put him out in the barn. Maybe you can make room among the oxen and the sheep for him. And so you and I come to a lost and dying world and we say, Christ is coming again. And they say, listen, we've been hearing that for 2,000 years now. 2017 years, Jesus is coming. Listen, I don't want to hear it. You know, the church doesn't want to hear it anymore. We have been thinking and waiting and expecting him. Everybody thought for sure, 1948, boy, the Jews are back in their land. The king is coming. I got news for you. In 1948, he didn't come. Because if he did, I wouldn't be here now, and neither would you. And then we knew in the 60s, that's it. He's coming for sure. Didn't make it. Then I got saved in the 70s. Now he's coming because I'm saved. I got it. Guess what? He didn't come. Everybody in the 70s were sure that Jesus was coming. And he didn't come. Ronald Reagan came in the 80s and we thought Jesus was following him, but he didn't. The point is, we have been expecting the king just as they expected him the first time. Yet when he came, nobody was ready. Angels had to come and sing it in the ears of the shepherds. Go quickly now to Bethlehem and see this thing that we told you. All right. And when they went with haste, they found the babe and his mother. And they found him just the way God said that they would find him, wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. So much of the world, so much of God's own children, so much of Christianity is tired of hearing that he's coming. That when he arrives, Jesus says, will I even find faith? My hope is that in 2017, this might be the year that he finally knocks on the door and says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. I want to be one of those who said, come in. You could change the whole Bible if you had had a hotel back in Bethlehem. And when Joseph and Mary knocked at the door, you and I would say, come on in. I got a beautiful room. I'll give you this. The presidential suite is yours. See how you would ruin the whole book? You would ruin the whole Christmas story if you had been back there. Because you would have been ready, right? You wouldn't have been like those people who let him pass by. If he came at your door, you wouldn't have said, oh, I'm tired of hearing that. Go and bother somebody else. You would have said, come in. Wouldn't you? But how many people today would still say, keep moving on down the road? I'm sure somebody else has room. I'm sure somebody else has a place where you could stay. But I've heard it all before. Sweetheart, next. Jesus says, can you not discern the times and the seasons? What is it the world is looking for right now? World peace. The world is often talking about a one world government. Everybody is trying to push us that way. The economy of the world, remember when there used to be 2 superpowers? Now we have to deal with 3 or 4. Why? Because the economy of the world is growing more and more, just like it did during the time of Rome. The Roman Empire and their economy grew and spread around the world. Our economy has grown and spread around the world to where we're making other countries wealthy. There's very few poor places left where we have not touched them. It's costing you and me more and more and more to buy stuff because these smaller nations are getting richer and richer, and so they're moving up their price. You can't hire anybody for a couple of bucks an hour anymore. Everybody wants real money to do real work, right? Why? Because this is signs of the time. Economically, the world is melding into one. Politically, the world is melding into one. Everybody is all wanting the same stuff. Religion, everybody is tired of it. Everybody's looking for the next new leader, the next new religion. And someday they're going to be given that guy. It's going to be the false one. Just as they were once waiting for Christ, now everybody's waiting for the Antichrist, and they don't even know it. But when he comes, everybody's going to clamor after him, and everybody's going to mistake him for the real thing. And a lot of those people are people who call themselves Christian. Will follow the wrong guy. That's the time we live in, though, where people, because of their removal of the Bible, even in Christianity, the Bible doesn't mean what it used to mean. Everything now is interpreted by you and me. What do I want it to mean? And so we can easily, you and I, what we think is equal to what the Bible says. That's the standard of today. If there's a part I don't like, I can get rid of it. If there's a standard, a rule, a regulation that I am not comfortable with, I don't have to have it. That's where we are today. So when the Antichrist comes in, holds up this book, quotes from it, and then changes it, everybody will say, oh, that's the way it should have been from the beginning. We are at that place, I think, that the Roman world was at when Jesus came the first time. I think we're just about ready again. How do I know? Because look at the apathy of people. Oh, not another, he's coming again. That's exactly what we're all thinking. But should we not be ready for him? Did he not promise to come? And if he promised to come the first time, and he came, is not his promise to come a second time then even more valid? Because now we can look and say, you know what? He promised it and he kept it. When the time was ready, he came. When the date that God recorded on this date, in this year, we're coming. Did he not also set a time? The Jewish father in ancient time, the Jewish dad set the time of the coming of the son's coming of age, if you would. Mikey comes and says, Dad, I'd like to marry my Mary. And I say, fine, son, you can marry Mary. So they'd come over to our house. I would pronounce them husband and wife. And then I'd say to Mary's dad, okay, take your daughter home now. And Mike would say, what? And I'd say, son, come on over to my house. You're going to live with me. She's going to live with her parents. And at some point in time, I'll tell you when, you can go get your bride. In the meantime, we got things to get ready. You're going to need a place to live. So what we'll do is we'll add an apartment onto the back of my house. And I could drag this out for a year. Anytime within that year, I could say to my son, why don't you go get your bride? But he couldn't do it until he built, you know he built that room in the first week. You'd never see a kid work so hard. Boy, he'd had that house all ready and built and ready to go, right? In my father's house are many apartments. And so there he is. The son went out. Him and his dad added on. And if dad was getting a little bit slow, the old boy would keep his dad moving, right? Because he wanted to go get his wife. And the dad could any time within a year say to his son, all right, today's the day. The son could begin to see that things were getting done. And he knew the time was close. But the dad didn't have to let him go on that particular day. He could hold it off. That's how it worked in the ancient day. And then one day the son would come to dad. Dad, is it today? Dad, is it today? See, that's what Jesus says. He said that the time and the seasons are in the Father's hands. When they asked him, when are you coming back? He said, that's not for me to know. That's in my Father's hands. And so my son Mike would come and say to Dad, Dad, is this the day? And he'd be all stuttering just like that. And I'd say, no, not today, son. I just don't feel like it. Then the next day he'd come. And after 9 months, Dad, is it time yet? Not yet. And then one day he'd come up to me, or maybe he is tired of even asking and he's just sitting down. And I'd say to him, son, what are you doing sitting there? Well, if I was you, I'd go get my bride. How long do you think it would take him to run and get his bride? But I would tell the neighbors about this time, hey, tomorrow or in about an hour, I'm going to tell my son. And they would go over and they would hide the bride. This is how cruel they were. This is where we get the thing about the bridal chase even today. And then the family would hide the bride in different homes. And the groom would go from house to house looking for his bride. And not find her here, not find her there, not find her here. And he would spend the whole day going crazy looking for her. Because Dad said today was the day you go get your bride and bring her back here. You've got the house all ready. Your job is all secure. Everything is ready. Today is the day. And then they would go off and hide her. But finally he'd find her. And they'd have a big party and everybody come back to Dad's house and there would be a feast, a festival that would last as long as Dad's money can hold out. My wife and I, about 15 minutes, we'd give them a party. And that's it. But then there would be this big party would go on and the son would bring home his bride. See, that's what Jesus is doing right now. Dad, is it today? Not just yet. There's a few things we have to finish up on the old house. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go and prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again and receive you unto myself. And that's the picture. The Jewish wedding. And one day the father says to the son, son, what's taking you so long? Why don't you go get her? And on that day the trumpets will sound and will be gathered together to him. And so shall we be with the Lord forever. That day is still coming. I think the world is more and more ready for that day to get here. I'm wondering, God gave signs for the first coming of Christ, but the world missed it. He gave signs for the second coming of Christ, and it's quite possible that we are missing those ones too. And so we have the words of Jesus. Can we not discern the times and the seasons? He said, I'm ashamed of you guys, talking to his disciples. He said, you could look at the weather, and you sit there and say, oh, you know what? There's a wind blowing from the west. It's going to rain today. Oh, the wind today is coming from the east. It's going to be hot. And you know what? You're right. You look out and you say, oh, it's red sky in the morning. It's going to be bad news. Oh, it's red sky tonight. Weather's going to be great tomorrow. And you know what? You're right. You know how to read the weather signs. Too bad you can't read the signs that God has given to you about the coming of his own Son. This is the morning of Christ. Next slide. Here's my thought and my conclusion with you. If we could trust God for the past. Everybody in this room believes that Jesus Christ came. We all celebrated Christmas. We all went out and we bought presents for people to remind ourselves of the gift of the wise men. We remembered that Jesus Christ, we gathered into this place, we sang, we gave our gift to the King, praise the Lord, for $1,376.58. Don't you try to cheat me, girl. And we thank God for that wonderful gift that we were able to collectively give him for his birthday. We didn't forget. We didn't forget that this was his birthday. We didn't forget as we came down and laid our monies in the manger that it was his birthday. We trusted him for the past. Our question then is, can we trust him for our present? Can we trust Christ? Can we trust God today? What has God recorded in heaven concerning you today? What is the fullness of time for you today? What is God expecting from you? What has God prepared? What has he done? Can we be satisfied with the things and know, what is it that God says? My thoughts about you are good. Can we trust that in our present? We look to the past, and what he thought about us was wonderful. He had thought about our salvation, and he provided a way. He even set the date when this would be accomplished. I'm wondering what he has set in my life today, and can I appreciate it? And what about my future? Here we are now in the future. This is the year 2017. Wow! When I was a kid, born in 1955, and growing up in the 60s, and when you talked about the year 2000, I mean, we were talking about living like the Jetsons. We weren't going to have tires on our cars anymore. Remember that? We was all going to be flying around. And here we are now, in the future. Who would have thought that you'd have your phone on your hip with you all the time? And your phone would instantly be a camera. It would be a navigational device so you don't get lost anymore. Siri, I'm trying to get to this. Oh, turn left, go right, 3 blocks. You're there. Look to your left. That's your destination. We have this marvelous instrument on our hip, which is greater than Dick Tracy ever thought to have. He had a 2-way wrist radio, and we thought that would be marvelous. I got a little thing for my phone, goes right here on my wrist, lets me answer my phone call right from my wrist. And it says, oh, you got a message coming in. Oh, who's it from? Oh, I don't want to hear from them. The name pops up and I know to ignore them. There's all kinds of wonderful devices that we have. We're living in the future. A future we could trust God for. I believe that Jesus Christ is coming again. And I'll tell you this much, I don't know when he's coming. I was hoping he was coming in 2016, but with 2017 here, I know this much, he's a year closer than he used to be. He's a whole lot closer to coming than he was when I got saved in the 70s. And I'm still waiting, and I'm still expecting. Because he kept his word the first time. I know he'll keep his word the second time.